The dust settled around my tires, thick and choking, mirroring the knot in my stomach. I stared at the raw, overturned earth, the brutalist crime scene where my house had stood just hours before, not damaged, not partially demolished. Gone. A fresh rectangle of dark soil stretched across the spot where 60 years of history had been rooted. Pieces of busted wood, shattered brick, twisted plumbing lay piled like garbage off to the side, as if someone had casually swept my memories into a corner. In the center of this devastation, the culprit stood idle and humming, a yellow Caterpillar bulldozer, still warm from its work. I froze, unable to breathe. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in my ears. The word bulldozer looped in my head like a broken alarm, a nightmare I couldn't shake myself awake from. The smell of fresh-cut earth and diesel hit my nose, nauseatingly familiar from childhood summers spent on this land, now laced with something acrid, something like betrayal. "Hey there, neighbor." The voice cut through the silence, smug and casual. I turned. It was Tom Banks, the guy who lived 2 lots over. Tall, gray hair slicked back, wearing a smug polo shirt and khakis like he was about to tee off on a private golf course. He had a travel mug in one hand and a pair of aviators resting on his head like some suburban Top Gun. "Thought you might swing by sooner or later," he continued, sipping his coffee. "Looks different, huh?" I couldn't answer. My jaw literally hung open. I was staring at the place where I first learned to ride a bike, the front porch where I'd fallen. Asleep one summer under the stars. The cracked red swing where Uncle Dale and I used to drink lemonade and listen to Rangers games on an old transistor radio. It was all gone, and this guy was smiling. "We figured the house was abandoned," Tom continued, his voice dripping with feigned concern. "We and the HOA had a meeting and, well, it was becoming an eyesore. Dangerous, you know. So, we moved forward, with clearing the lot. You'll like what's coming. My wife and I are putting in a nice new garage and workshop combo. Something tasteful." I blinked, finally finding my voice, a choked whisper. "You? What?" "Oh, don't worry. It's all above board. I've got paperwork. We're revitalizing this side of the community." I stepped closer, my fists clenched so tight my knuckles popped. "That house was mine. I inherited it legally. You destroyed private property." Tom sipped his coffee and shrugged. "No one had seen you in weeks. HOA considered it neglected. HOA doesn't govern this land." He smiled wider now, and I saw it, that cold glint in his eye. The one that says, "I've already decided what's yours is mine." That was the moment it hit me. This wasn't incompetence. This wasn't miscommunication. This was theft. Arrogant, methodical, daylight theft. A hollowness spread through my chest, not just anger, but a profound sense of loss. Someone had scraped my family off the face of this land like we never existed. I wasn't just looking at dirt. I was standing in the grave of my memories, and the man who killed them was sipping coffee 10 feet away. I looked him dead in the eye and said, my voice trembling with a fury I barely recognized, "I'm calling the police." "You do that," he said, not flinching. "Just make sure your paperwork's in order, Eric. Would be a shame if things got messy." The officer arrived about 20 minutes later, just as Tom was giving a tour of my land to a local contractor, gesturing with dramatic flair like he was some kind of visionary developer. I stood near the edge of the demolished foundation, arms crossed, trying not to shake. When the cruiser rolled up, I flagged it down so hard I thought I'd tear my shoulder out. "Officer," I started, my voice strained. "Someone illegally demolished my home and is building on my land without my consent. That man," I pointed at Tom, who raised his mug in mock greeting, "claims he got approval from the HOA, but this property isn't in an HOA. I have the deed, I have the title, it's mine." The officer, a young guy who looked like he still got carded at bars, frowned and scribbled something into a notepad. "All right, sir. Do you have documents to prove ownership?" I had them in triplicate. I'd been carrying the folder in my truck ever since the first HOA letter showed up weeks ago. I handed it over like it was a sword, and this was war. He took it and began flipping through, nodding. But then Tom's attorney arrived. He was exactly the type you'd expect. Tan, teeth too white, voice like a Bluetooth speaker. "My client is within his rights," he said before even introducing himself. "We have a signed agreement from the HOA, a notice of abandonment and municipal clearance for demolition due to structural safety concerns." He opened his own folder with theatrical flair. I leaned over and squinted. The papers looked official. There were stamps, signatures, and even a line where someone, allegedly me, had agreed to release the structure for demolition. I didn't know whether to scream or laugh. "That's not my signature," I said, pointing. "I never signed any of this. That's not even my handwriting." The officer looked between us, clearly uncomfortable. "All right, I think we need to take this downtown, get everything verified." I called my attorney, Sarah Martin, before I even left the driveway. Sarah's the kind of lawyer who keeps a fireproof safe in her trunk and drinks black coffee that smells like gasoline. When she picked up, she didn't waste time with sympathy. "Text me photos of what they showed the cop. I'll cross-check it against the county registry and the title office. If that signature's fake, they just crossed into criminal territory." Later that afternoon, I sat across from her in her office, still covered in dust. She slid my deed and property map across the table with one eyebrow raised. "This land was officially transferred to you 6 weeks ago. It's registered, notarized, taxed, and you've even received county mail at that address. There's no legal abandonment. And that HOA?" She tapped her tablet. "Doesn't even include your lot. Their jurisdiction ends 3 blocks south." "So what's their game?" I asked, my voice tight. "Simple. They assumed you wouldn't show up in time, so they fabricated a paper trail, hoping no one would challenge it." A bitter laugh escaped me. "So they gambled my house against their lies." Sarah leaned back in her chair, her face like steel. "And now they're going to lose everything." She promised a full investigation. We'd get every document analyzed, request the original demolition permit, and challenge every signature. Meanwhile, she told me to keep a low profile and install more cameras. But that night, as I parked near the site and looked at the half-framed skeleton of Tom's garage shining under temporary construction lights, I realized one thing. They weren't just building a garage. They were burying what was left of my uncle's legacy and daring me to stop them. What started as a legal headache quickly evolved into a full-blown campaign of strategic exposure. Sarah and I were done playing defense. We went on the offensive. She pulled public records, subpoenaed permits, and filed a motion to freeze all construction on my property. Meanwhile, I worked with a private investigator, Chester Kahn, Ben Harper, an ex-cop turned bloodhound with a taste for exposing smug bastards. Ben didn't disappoint. Within a week, he'd uncovered a gold mine. Email exchanges between Tom and the HOA's vice president discussing how to secure and repurpose my land under the guise of community development. They even referenced a demolition company known for looking the other way on paperwork. One Ben confirmed had been cited for similar mistaken teardowns in the past. Most damning was a blurry photo of a meeting where Tom literally pointed at my house on a projector screen with the words, "Potential," garage site beneath it. The timestamp? 2 weeks before the demolition. It was fraud. Systematic, arrogant, and utterly intentional. Sarah was furious, in her calm, controlled ice blade of justice kind of way. She began assembling a case thick enough to choke a judge's. Inbox, trespass, forgery, destruction of private property, zoning violations, every document forged, every false report, every shady contractor signature, they were all going into the war chest. The judge granted a preliminary hearing. Momentum was ours, and then Tom came to my door. It was a Sunday afternoon. My kids were inside watching cartoons. I was out back installing a second trail cam just to keep an eye on the property line. I heard gravel crunch under heavy boots, and when I turned around, there he was. Tom Banks, red-faced, breathing hard like he'd jogged over, fists balled at his sides. No lawyer, no HOA clipboard, just a pissed-off man who knew the walls were closing in. "You think you're clever?" he growled, stepping into my space. "You think dragging lawyers into this is going to fix anything?" I stood still, heart thudding. "I don't think I know." He jabbed a finger into my chest. "I built half that garage already. You can't undo what's done. You're going to lose more than your temper before this is over. You really want to drag your family through this circus?" I didn't flinch. Instead, I pointed toward the corner of my roof. See that little dome? Audio and video recording since you stepped on the driveway. Want to keep talking? That was the spark. His expression twisted into rage like something deep inside finally snapped. He swung fast, sloppy. He caught me across the cheek with a wild haymaker. Burning pain, stars, in my vision. I stumbled back, more shocked than hurt. I hadn't been punched since college. Then instinct kicked in. I shoved him hard, sending him stumbling into my garden bed. He came back swinging again, but I blocked him this time and got in one solid shot to his ribs. We were breathing hard, scuffling like two dogs over a bone. It wasn't some choreographed movie fight. It was raw, angry, and real. And then, "Hey, stop." It was Jason, my neighbor from across the street. Ex-Marine. Good guy. He sprinted over the fence in about 3 steps, shouting as he pulled out his phone. "Cops are on the way." Tom backed off, eyes wild. "You don't know what you're getting into, Holland. We had a deal." Jason stepped between us like a bouncer. "You better shut your mouth and sit down before this turns into a real mistake." Tom turned, muttered something unintelligible, and stumbled off down the driveway. I touched my jaw, swollen, split lip. My pulse was still hammering, adrenaline roaring through me like jet fuel. Jason looked at me and raised a brow. "You all, right?" I nodded. "You saw everything?" He nodded back. "Every second, and I'll say the same to the cops." And he did. When the police arrived, Jason gave his statement on the spot, and it was airtight. Tom had trespassed, made threats, and assaulted me on camera, both from my porch security and from Jason's own phone. The officers weren't exactly sympathetic when they cuffed Tom down the street, but the bigger shock came the next day. Jason posted a detailed account of what happened on the neighborhood's private forum. Within hours, other neighbors, ones who'd been silent or wary before, started reaching out. Some shared their own experiences. Others admitted they'd always suspected Tom was up to something shady, but never had the nerve to say it aloud. One woman even revealed she'd been pressured by the HOA to sign off on documents she hadn't read. Another neighbor said she'd heard Tom on the phone trying to sell extra garage space. Tom wasn't just falling, he was free-falling. And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt the tide shift. This was no longer just my fight. Tom's arrest hit the neighborhood like a lightning bolt. By Monday morning, the HOA's once pristine image began to buckle under the weight of scrutiny, rumor, and cold, hard truth. Jason's post had gone semi-viral in our local community forum. Screenshots of Tom's outburst, the fight, and even a clip of him being led into a police cruiser were spreading faster than wildfire in a dry Texas field. At first, a few loyalists tried to downplay it. "Oh, Tom must have just snapped under pressure. Eric probably provoked him. It's all a misunderstanding. You'll see." But then came the real cracks. One by one, neighbors who had once nodded politely at HOA meetings or avoided them altogether began to come forward, not just with opinions, but with evidence. Mary Linton from the corner lot revealed she'd been strong-armed into voting for HOA proposals by being told her landscaping was non-compliant. Steve, a retired postal worker, posted a photo of a letter Tom had slipped under his door weeks earlier, urging him to support the garage project for the betterment of neighborhood property values. The tone was friendly, the wording borderline coercive. And then there was Linda. Linda Morrison had been the HOA's treasurer for 8 years, mild, quiet, always the one taking notes in the background. She finally spoke up. In a public thread, she wrote, "I never agreed with what Tom and Karen did to Eric's property. I raised concerns but was told to trust the process. I now realize that process was a fraud. I'm resigning effective immediately, and I'm willing to testify to everything." I know, that was the dam breaking. Sarah and Ben, my legal team turned investigative duo, began fielding messages from residents who had once feared retaliation, but now saw an opportunity to set things right. HOA board minutes were leaked, edited versions that conveniently omitted any mention of my property were compared to original drafts neighbors still had in their email archives. And guess what? The vote to take over my land had never actually happened. They'd forged the minutes. Every new piece of testimony was like dropping another stone on a collapsing bridge. I watched the community go from quiet suburb to small town. Rebellion. Lawn signs that once read "Proud member of Maple Hollow HOA" started disappearing overnight. One neighbor painted over theirs with "I support property rights" in red spray paint. The irony? People weren't just angry on my behalf. They were furious at what they realized they'd allowed to fester in their own backyards. The HOA had bullied people for years, threatening fines for having a bird bath too tall, for flying the wrong size flag, for painting a shed without approval. Now they realized the wolf had been guarding the hen house. At the next HOA meeting, usually a dull hour in the library conference room with maybe 6 attendees, nearly 50 people showed up. Karen, Tom's wife, was supposed to lead it in his absence. She didn't get 2 sentences in before someone shouted, "When were you planning to tell us about the forged signatures, Karen?" Someone else chimed in, "We want a full audit." Another voice, "I never voted for any of this." Karen, pale and visibly rattled, tried to maintain order, but the room was done listening. It wasn't a meeting anymore. It was a reckoning. She left 5 minutes later, escorted out by a volunteer librarian who looked deeply amused by the chaos. By the end of the week, the HOA was effectively non-functional. Board members were resigning faster than we could track, and my legal team was finalizing a court motion to suspend the HOA's ability to manage funds or enforce any guidelines until an independent review could be completed. What had once been a tidy, controlling regime now resembled a crumbling stage set, facade intact, but nothing behind it but rot. And through it all, my house still hadn't returned. But now, at least, I wasn't fighting alone. The courtroom was packed. On the first day of the trial, standing room only. Half the neighborhood showed up. Reporters filled the back rows, and even the judge looked faintly amused when he glanced at the overflowing gallery. But there was no laughter from me. This wasn't spectacle. This was war, and I'd come armed with every fact, every testimony, and every ounce of truth I could carry. Tom Banks entered wearing a cheap navy suit that did nothing to hide the panic simmering just beneath his practiced scowl. Karen, his wife, sat 2 rows behind him with crossed arms and a look that could curdle milk. Several of the former HOA board members, those who hadn't resigned outright, sat silently beside her, paling as they saw familiar faces from the community, giving them death stares. Sarah, my attorney, opened with the kind of quiet fury only years of courtroom experience can deliver. She laid out the foundation: a legal property deed, a demolished home, a forged trail of signatures, and a hostile takeover of private land under the fraudulent use of HOA authority. Then she dropped the hammer. What Mr. Banks and his co-conspirators did wasn't just civil trespass. It was calculated, coordinated fraud. They used power they did not legally have to erase a man's home, his history, and his future, and for that they must be held accountable. And one by one we brought the receipts. Jason testified first. Calm, clear, credible. He described the assault, the threats, the warning signs. Then came Linda, the former treasurer, who walked the court through exactly how the HOA minutes were altered post-meeting to make it appear as though there had been a unanimous vote for demolition when no such vote had occurred. Then we showed the emails. My God, the emails. Ben Harper had uncovered strings between Tom and contractors referring to my property as untapped HOA asset and soon-to-be repurposed land. There were even texts between Tom and Karen discussing how to forge Eric's release form so the permit. Guys don't whine. I watched their faces drop. Karen visibly shook her head like she could deny what we were all reading. But the final nail was the video, the confrontation on my front lawn. Tom's threats, the punch, Jason, shouting in the background, the audio crystal clear. The defense barely had anything to offer. They stammered, danced, tried to paint me as absentee and combative, but the judge wasn't having it. She interrupted the defense twice to clarify inconsistencies, once even stating flatly, "Counsel, your argument borders on insulting the court's intelligence." By the third day, it was clear the jury didn't need convincing. They were nodding along with Sarah. One woman actually gasped when Karen's name came up in the forged permit applications. When the verdict was delivered, The silence in the room was deafening. We, the jury, find the defendants Thomas Banks, Karen Banks, and 3 additional members of the Maple Hollow Homeowners Association guilty of criminal trespass, conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery of official documents, and unlawful destruction of private property. The judge didn't stop there. She sentenced Tom to 95 years in state prison, citing the brazen disregard for legal boundaries and ethical decency. Karen got 2 years for conspiracy and tampering with records. The other HOA board members received 18-month sentences with probation and mandatory restitution. Then came the civil damages. I was awarded $1.5 million, $800,000 for the value of the home and land lost, $250,000 for legal costs, and the rest for emotional distress, punitive damages, and what the judge referred to as egregious abuse of pseudo-authority under the guise of HOA governance. The gavel fell with a finality that sent a chill down the room. Tom's jaw clenched, his face white. Karen burst into tears. One of the board members fainted. I just sat there, hands folded, staring straight ahead, not smiling, not celebrating, just done. Outside, reporters shouted questions. I said nothing. I let Sarah handle it. I didn't need to explain myself. The truth had spoken. The law had listened, and justice finally had come swinging. 6 months later, the land looked nothing like it had on that first awful day. The garage Tom tried to build was long gone, reduced to a slab of cracked concrete now serving as my new fire pit patio. In place of the wreckage stood a modern 2-story home with high ceilings, stone siding, a wraparound porch, and floor-to-ceiling windows. Facing the tree line, it was everything I had imagined and more. Around the property, I had a custom cedar fence installed, tall, sturdy, reinforced. At the front gate, under a wrought iron arch, hung a wooden sign I had made by a local artist. It read, "Private property. No trespassing, HOA-free zone, unapologetically so." Just beneath it, in smaller brass letters, read, "Smile. You're not forging anything today." Some of the neighbors said I should have been more subtle. Others said it was perfect. I didn't much care. It made me laugh every time I saw it. And that was all I needed. But the real highlight came on the 4th of July. See, Jason had this idea. Why not throw a neighborhood barbecue? Celebrate the win, the rebuild, the freedom from tyranny. I wasn't so sure at first, but then Mary volunteered to bring pies. Steve offered his famous smoked brisket, and someone even donated a bounce house. By the afternoon, my yard was full. Kids running through sprinklers, dogs chasing frisbees, and grown adults clinking beers while standing in the very place where Tom once tried to steal everything. The irony was delicious. And then Karen showed up. Well, kind of. Not in person. She was still doing time. But someone brought a cardboard cutout of her, life-sized, aviators and all. Someone duct-taped a plastic wine glass to its hand, and folks lined up to take selfies with it like she was Bigfoot. Someone stuck a speech bubble on it that read, "Your grass violates community standards." We laughed until we couldn't breathe. At sunset, I stood near the grill, watching the sky explode in red, white, and blue. Jason clapped me on the back. "You know," he said, "you didn't just win your land back. You gave this place its spine." Shook my head with a grin. Nah, I just reminded everyone they had one. As the fireworks crackled overhead, someone started chanting, "No more HOAs, no more HOAs." And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a guy who got his house back. I felt like a man who reclaimed his peace and helped a neighborhood do the same.